am reading Chapter 10 of UCC Sales, Excuses for Non-Performance. The sections and definitions that apply to this chapter are shown in Figure 10-2, including 2-613, 14, 15, and 16, 2-613 definition when the contract requires for its performance goods identified when the contract is made. Interesting. And then commercially impracticable is 2-614. Stands for basic assumption on which contract is made. And 2-616 stands for substantial impairment of the value of the whole contract as it relates to installment contracts. So that first statement that I said that sounded like part of a definition relates to impossibility, change circumstances. For example, a change by substituted performance that may be related to commercially impracticable, but the basic assumption on which a contract is made is a failure of presupposed conditions. And a casualty. So a casualty is another example of potential impossibility or commercial impracticability. So we will discover those a bit later as we read on. So when one party simply cannot perform as the contract requires, that party's non-performance is sometimes excused, and the other party is limited or prevented from obtaining remedies for breach of contract. This chapter discusses when a party is excused from performing. If there is no valid excuse for non-performance, the party who fails to perform is in breach of contract. Fun little diagram on page 203 about contract formation, and if there's no excuses, then the conclusion would be that a failure to perform is a breach of an enforceable and is enforceable. But the other side of the table is when there is a valid excuse for non-performance, and the conclusion is that the failure to perform is not a breach. And in italics, it's saying unenforceable contract. In general, the contract for sale, at least between experienced buyers and sellers, puts on the seller the risk of price risks in the market and on the buyer the risk of price falls in the market. However, such contracts presuppose that the general business climate will continue in a fashion that makes the contract performable by reasonable business effort. In a long-term relationship, unforeseen circumstances can change the value that each party originally expected to extract from the contract relationship. The parties may try to provide for such contingency in their original contract document. Alternatively, they may try to work together to adjust to the changed circumstances. Finally, if the parties cannot agree, Article 2 fills the gap. This chapter explores each of those possible reactions to changed circumstances. 1. Contract provisions, force majeure clauses. And sometimes at the time of contracting, the parties negotiate for a contract provision that determines their respective rights and obligations with certain events beyond the control of either party occur. Such contract provisions are commonly known as force majeure clauses. There is no such thing as a standard force majeure clause. However, there are certain natural events that are frequently included, such as earthquakes, floods, fire, and other natural disasters. Some contracts will also reference political acts such as terrorism, riots, and war. Because a force majeure clause can relieve a party of liability for non-performance, the contract's list of the events that excuse performance is often the subject of intense negotiation. Force majeure clauses may vary depending on the type of contract involved and the types of risks that the parties wish to address. If insurance is available to insure against the risk of a particular loss, the parties may agree to omit that event from the force majeure clause and instead rely on insurance to cover the potential loss. Figure 10-4 on the next page contains 2 sample force majeure clauses. Section 2, contract modifications to accommodate unforeseen circumstances. Even if the contract initially makes no provision for excuse due to unforeseen circumstances, at the time such circumstances actually occur, the parties always can enter into negotiations and agree upon a contract modification to adjust to the changed circumstances. Section 2-209 encourages such agreed on modifications by providing that no consideration is necessary to make modifications enforceable as long as the modifications are in good faith. Require no consideration in response to unforeseen circumstances. Before moving to section 3, I'm just going to read this post-it that I've put into the book here. It says, if the event is a basic assumption on which the contract was made and was something foreseeable during the contract formation, the seller is presumed to have assumed the risk of the occurrence, essentially promising to perform. I don't know where I got that from. But anyway, part 3, code provisions. Finally, if the contract contains no provisions that would govern the changed circumstance and the parties are unable or unwilling to voluntarily modify their agreement at that time, 3 sections of Article 3 fill the gap and define the circumstances that partially or wholly relieve the party of contract obligations without liability or with only reduced liability to the other party. There's 3 gap fillers when a voluntary modification is not undertaken by the parties. So there's a part 3.1, excuse by reason of improper performance by other party, and excuse due to impossibility. And is there another one for excuse of substituted performance due to changed circumstances? Excuse of substituted performance due to changed circumstances. And part 4, excuse due to commercial impracticability. Is that the last section? There's a case. And that probably will conclude chapter 10. No, there's a common law grounds for excuse, but it's very short. It says, as previously noted, the common law supplements the UCC where it has not been displaced. Thus, common law excuses for performance, such as the death of a contracting party, failure of a condition, supplement the excuse provisions in Article 2. And again, those are the death of a contracting party and failure of condition. At common law. So, excuse by reason of improper performance by other party. Part 3.1. Sometimes performance by one party will be excused because of the other contracting party's improper performance or breach. For example, you have already seen how Section 2601 requires both the tender of delivery and the condition of the goods to be exactly as promised in the contract. If the delivery or goods fail to conform to the contract when the time for performance is due, there is a present breach, and the party receiving the delivery or goods may be excused from his or her own performance under the contract. So I'm just going to say 2-601 and example non-conforming goods are delivered. Or maybe even tendered. But anyway, 3.2, excuse for impossibility. Section 2-613 comes closest to the codification of the common law doctrine of excuse due to impossibility of performance. Law students usually recall the famous contracts case of Taylor v. Caldwell, where a landowner was excused from performing a contract to let a music hall because the hall burned down, without the landowner's fault, before the performance was scheduled. In that case, the court reasoned, where from the nature of the contract it appears that the parties must from the beginning have known that it could not be fulfilled unless when the time for the fulfillment of the contract arrived, some particular specific thing continued to exist, so that when entering into the contract they must have contemplated such continuing existence as the foundation of what was to be done. The contract is construed as subject to an implied condition that the parties shall be excused in case, before breach, performance becomes impossible from the perishing of the thing without default of the contractor. Favorite line from contract law ever. This reasoning is reflected in section 2-613, which is titled Casualty to Identified Goods. So we're going to give this example. 2-613 example casualty of two identified goods. A careful reading of that section, however, makes it clear that the scope of section 2-613 is not as broad as the title suggests. Rather, the scope is limited to situations where a contract requires forced performance goods identified when the contract is made. In such cases, section 613 excuses performance in those goods suffer casualty without fault of either party before the risk of loss passes to the buyer. So casualty requires, one, no fault of seller before risk of loss passes to buyer. And what did it first require? Oh, goods identified at the time of the contract? When the contract is made. Goods identified when the contract is made. It follows, as it did in Taylor v. Caldwell, that if particular goods are required for the performance of the contract and those goods are damaged or destroyed, performance should be excused. If the destruction is not total, section 2-613 gives the buyer the right to choose between requiring partial performance with due allowance for the incomplete performance or treating the contract as avoided but in any event without further rights against the seller. In other words, the seller will be excused from full performance. So the buyer may accept partial performance and otherwise seller performance is excused without further rights against the seller. And the only difficulty in applying 2-613 is the need to determine whether a contract requires for its performance goods identified when the contract was made. Note the distinction between goods identified when the contract was made and a contract that requires particular goods for its performance. For example, if Fancy enters into a contract to buy the Mona Lisa, the subject of that contract, the painting of the Mona Lisa, is identified when the contract is made because it is both identified and existing. The Mona Lisa is unique. There is no other painting that is the same. Copies are not originals. Hence, not only is the Mona Lisa identified at the time the contract is made, but in this case, the contract also requires the Mona Lisa for its performance. In contrast, assume that Fancy enters into a contract to buy 3 go-go watches from an identified fungible bulk of 30 go-go watches. Based on our previous discussion of identification, the watches would be identified at the time of the contract because they are both existing and identified as part of an identified fungible bulk. However, if 27 of the watches were destroyed before the date set for performance, Section 2-613 would not govern the excuse analysis because even though the watches were identified, no particular watches were required for the performance of the contract. Any of the original 30 would do. That excuse analysis will be performed under Section 2-615 discussed in Section 3.4 below. So 3.3 comes before 3.4, which is changes excuses due to commercial impracticability. But 3.3 is excuse of substitute performance due to changed circumstances. So Section 2-614 deals with a very narrow set of changed circumstances that require substitute performance to be provided and accepted under the limited circumstances outlined in that section, which is the agreed berthing, loading, or unloading facilities fail, or an agreed type of carrier becomes unavailable, or the agreed manner of delivery otherwise becomes commercially impracticable. Official Comment 1 to Section 2-614 emphasizes distinction between that section and Sections 2-613 and 2-615, both of which deal with excuse and complete avoidance of the contract where the totality of the expected performance is affected, suggesting that this section deals with an incidental matter. Excuse due to a commercial impracticability, Section 3-4. Section 2-615 introduces the code concept of impracticability. Under the specific language of that section, the seller may be excused from performance if performance has been made impracticable by the occurrence of a contingency, the non-occurrence of which was a basic assumption of the contract that was made. This section can be broken down into 4 elements. 1, performance as agreed has been made impracticable. 2, impracticability was caused by the occurrence of a contingency, the non-occurrence of which was a basic assumption on which the contract was made. 3, the impracticability was not the fault of the party seeking excuse. And 4, the seller did not assume a greater obligation and cannot substitute performance under Section 2-614. Official Comment 8 elaborates on this point. It emphasizes that express agreements as to exemptions designed to enlarge upon or supplant the provisions in the section are to be read in the light of the mercantile sense and reason. So I'm not going to go into, I am going to go into the other 3 elements just a little more. Performance, number 1 being performance as agreed when as agreed has been made impracticable. The code does not define impracticable, but the official comments and relevant case law give some guidance. First, Official Comment 4 emphasizes that increased cost alone does not excuse performance unless the rise in cost is due to some unforeseen contingency which alters the essential nature of the performance. Similarly, some courts have referred to performance that is made vitally different. Element number 2, impracticability was caused by the occurrence of a contingency, the non-occurrence of which was a basic assumption on which the contract was made. I've written in the margin here, unreasonable to contemplate, and further, seasonable notice of failure to deliver or lateness. Again, the official comments elaborate on the meaning of this element. Official comment 1 refers broadly to unforeseen supervening circumstances not within the contemplation of the parties at the time of contracting. Official comment 4 cites a severe shortage of raw materials or supplies due to contingencies such as a war embargo, local crop failure, and unforeseen shutdown of major sources of supply. Official comment 5 speaks directly to the failure of a particular source of supply. A question of differentiation apparently is whether it can it be done at all versus can this seller do it. Courts and commentators have sometimes used a foreseeability test to determine if this element has been met. Official comment 8 specifically states that the exemptions of this section do not apply when the contingency is sufficiently foreshadowed at the time of the contracting to be included among the business risks which are fairly to be regarded as part of the Dickard terms. However, the mere fact that a contingency would have been foreseen at the time of contracting does not lead directly to the conclusion that the parties allowed the risk of its occurrence so that Section 2-615 could not apply. The distinction is discussed in some detail by the court below in specialty tires. And the last element that I'm going to discuss is the third element. The impracticability was not the fault of the party seeking excuse. The meaning of this requirement is self-evident. The doctrine of excuse has never operated to relieve a party of contract obligations when the party's inability to perform was his own fault. And last, the seller did not assume a greater obligation and cannot substitute performance under 2-614.